Hello, and welcome back to the Perspectives in History podcast. I'm your host, Willem Connor. Thank you very much for listening, as always. This is part 2 of our series on the Iron Guard, entitled Emissary of the Archangel.
I have no housekeeping announcements to go over at the top of the show, so without further ado, let's just begin.
Previously, in the first episode of our series on the interwar Romanian fascist movement known as the Iron Guard, we began by discussing Romania's involvement in the First World War. Romania was a rather young nation when the Great War broke out in July 1914. Initially, its leaders opted to stay out of the conflict, but ultimately the opportunity to annex majority Romanian territories of the Austro-Hungarian Empire proved irresistible, and in 1916, Romania entered the war on the side of the Triple Entente. To make a long story short, Romania was defeated on the battlefield, but the victory of the Entente elsewhere in Europe meant that at the end of the war, the country found itself on the winning side. With the annexation of Transylvania, Bukovina, and Banat from the now defunct Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the annexation of Bessarabia from the former Russian Empire, the nationalist dream of Greater Romania had at last been achieved. However, far from inaugurating a new era of peace and prosperity, the realization of Greater Romania would only bring about more issues. Interwar Romania would be characterized largely by political instability and a steady decline of liberal democracy into right-wing authoritarianism. That said, in the months and years immediately following the war's conclusion, it appeared that the principal threat to Romanian democracy came from the far left rather than the far right. At least, this was the view of one young law student, Corneliu Zelea Codreanu. Codreanu's father, Ioanid Zelea Codreanu, was a radical right-wing activist, and young Corneliu was exposed to his ideology from a young age. In 1919, when there appeared to be in danger of an invasion from Soviet Russia, Codreanu, having recently graduated from high school, gathered together a number of his classmates in a secret meeting where they vowed to wage a guerrilla war against the communist invaders. Such an invasion failed to materialize, however, and Codreanu went off to study at the University of Iași later that year. At the university, he came under the influence of Professor A.C. Cuza, a notorious anti-Semite. As Codreanu himself put it, he, quote, learned enough anti-Semitism in 1 year to last him several lifetimes, end quote. It was thanks, at least in part, to Cuza that Codreanu became a fervent believer in the theory of Judeo-Bolshevism. According to proponents of this idea, which has widely been discredited as an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, communism was created and propagated by the Jewish people to further their ultimate goal, that being the destruction of Western, read Christian, civilization. Codreanu's approach to the so-called Jewish question differed somewhat from his contemporary anti-Semites. Rather than seeing the Jewish people as a purely racial enemy, as was the case in Nazi Germany, or a purely religious enemy, as was the case in Tsarist Russia, his antagonism towards the Jews was expressed primarily in national and economic terms. I should emphasize the word primarily. Race and religion still factored very much into his thoughts on the matter. Codreanu believed that there existed a Jewish plot to dispossess the Romanian people of all they owned, including their land, and that once this had been achieved, their ultimate goal was to establish a new Zion in the land that had formerly been Romania. Of course, this is not to say that Codreanu's worldview was more grounded in reality than his contemporaries. Quite the contrary, religion and mysticism played a significant role in the shaping of his ideology. Codreanu would often play on the religious beliefs of his followers and utilize the Orthodox Church to further his own ends, but these strategies do not seem to have been purely cynical. As Codreanu himself phrased it, quote, the Jewish press attacks the religious feelings within us, weakens the moral resistance in men, and attempts to destroy our ties with eternity. It spreads anti-nationalistic theories, weakens the faith of the people, and estranges it from the soil. The Jews take us from our love for God, the love which always gives us inspiration for our struggle, end quote. We will have a lot more to say about the ideology of Codreanu and the movement that he helped to create later on. For now, let's return to the narrative. At the time that he went to attend university at Iași, Codreanu found that the city had become somewhat of a hotbed of socialist agitation within the country. Feeling obliged to take action, he joined a local paramilitary group called the Guard of National Consciousness, in which he quickly assumed a leading role. With this group, Codreanu and others engaged in street fights with protesting workers and led efforts to break labor strikes. He began to harbor ambitions to turn the Guard of National Consciousness into a nationwide movement by creating nationalist-aligned unions, thereby turning the workers against communism. But the eventual dissipation of socialist activity in the city led to the disbanding of the organization. Codreanu then refocused his efforts towards organizing among his fellow students at the university. In his capacity as a student activist, Codreanu protested changes by the administration he deemed unacceptable and frequently got into fights with other students. This went on for some time before the university administration grew tired of his antics and attempted to expel him from the university, although they were only partially successful in this. The intervention of Professor Cuza allowed Codreanu to continue taking courses, but he never received the diploma that he was supposed to when he graduated in 1922. In autumn of that same year, Codreanu moved to Germany to continue his studies. There he was first made aware of other right-wing political movements in Europe, like Mussolini's fascists in Italy and the still embryonic Nazi Party in Germany. Codreanu ultimately cut his time abroad short to return to Romania and assume a leadership role in a massive student protest against a proposal for a new Romanian constitution. This protest movement was anti-Semitic, at least outwardly, which gave Codreanu hope that he could channel the students' frustrations into more meaningful political action. This failed to materialize in large part because the majority of students did not share Codreanu's lofty political ambitions and primarily wanted their material concerns to be addressed. By March of 1923, it was becoming apparent that the student protest movement was losing its momentum. It was at this time that Codreanu, together with Professor Cuza, founded a new political party known as the League of National Christian Defense, or the LANC. One of the new party's first actions was to send a delegation of peasants to the capital city of Bucharest to present a list of demands to Prime Minister Ion Brătianu. They were granted an audience but found the Prime Minister to be non-committal. Having failed to achieve their aims through democratic means, Codreanu and a group of his close collaborators decided to resort to violence. They plotted a campaign of terroristic assassinations of specific targets whom they deemed to be the most responsible for Romania's current problems. Their hit list included both prominent Jewish bankers, religious leaders, and journalists, as well as Romanian politicians whom they accused of betraying their country and selling out to Jewish interests. The conspirators had only just devised a preliminary plan of action when, on the night of October 8, 1923, their hideout in Bucharest was raided by police. Codreanu and his 6 co-conspirators were arrested and taken in for questioning. When giving a statement to police, Codreanu did not deny the intentions of himself and the others. Quote, "Yes, those handguns are ours. We wanted to shoot with them the ministers, the rabbis, and the big Jewish bankers. The former because they betrayed their country, the latter because they are our enemies. We regret nothing. Though we have fallen, it does not matter. Behind us are tens of thousands of others who think likewise." End quote. The only thing Codreanu denied was that they had determined a specific date on which to carry out these assassinations, which was technically true. After the initial questioning, the conspirators were taken to the Vacaresti prison north of Bucharest to await trial. By Codreanu's account, the conditions at the prison were inhospitable, to put it mildly. Quote, "We were taken to a yard in the middle of which rose a tall church. All around there were walls and cells within them. I was put in a cell way back, 1 yard wide and 2 deep, which was locked on the outside. There was only one plank bed inside, and near the door was a small, iron-grilled window. I wondered where my comrades were. I lay my head on the board and fell asleep. I woke up after just 2 hours, shaking. It was cold, and no sun's rays penetrated into the cell. Dazedly, I looked around me and could hardly believe where I was. I looked well and saw the absolute misery of the cell. I told myself, this is a difficult situation. A wave of pain ripped through my heart, but I consoled myself. It is all for our people." End quote. Codreanu used his time in prison to draw up plans for the new organization that he would create upon being released, whenever that may be. In his conception, this new organization would be a branch of the LANC, the party that he co-founded with Professor Cuza. While the LANC itself would handle political matters, that is, putting up candidates for election and whatnot, Codreanu's new offshoot would be dedicated to providing education and combat training for Romanian youths. For some time, Codreanu pondered what this new organization should be called. Then, suddenly, it came to him in a flash of inspiration. The prison at Vacaresti was housed in a former monastery, and the chapel had been left intact. Prisoners were allowed to visit the chapel. In his memoir, Codreanu describes the reaction he had upon seeing the chapel's icon, of St. Michael the Archangel. Quote, "We went to look at the icon and we were truly amazed. The icon appeared to us of unsurpassed beauty. Before, I was never attracted to the beauty of any icon, but now I felt bound to this one with all my soul, and I had the feeling that the Archangel was alive and with us. Since then I have come to love that icon. Anytime we found the church open, we entered and prayed before it. Our hearts were filled with peace and joy." End quote. The appearance of this icon of St. Michael the Archangel made such a profound impression on Codreanu that he decided to dedicate this new organization to him. A few words about Michael the Archangel for those who might not be familiar. Michael the Archangel is a figure venerated across all the Abrahamic faiths, including Judaism, and nearly all denominations of Christianity. In Christianity, especially in the Orthodox tradition, Michael is seen as the role model of a spiritual warrior, understood to be the commander of God's armies in their triumph over the forces of Satan. The association of Michael the Archangel with war and conflict can be seen clearly in numerous Orthodox icons, where he is depicted holding a banner and slaying a dragon, often interpreted to be Satan, with a sword. It's worth noting that the Legion was not unique in adopting the figure of St. Michael the Archangel as the symbol of a political movement, the Union of the Russian People, which was a formation of the Black Hundreds movement and is often referred to as a proto-fascist party, also adopted St. Michael the Archangel as their patron. Constantin Iordachi, in his study of Romanian fascist ideology, provides the following explanation of the influence this figure had on the development of the Legion. Quote, "The cult of the punitive figure of St. Michael thus became the main source of the Legion's doctrine and the object of a fanatic legionary cult. Michael's observance on 8 November was proclaimed as the official celebration of the movement. Legionaries adopted an apocalyptic, almost Manichaean vision of the world, portraying themselves as an earthly Christian army, as knights of the light in a perpetual fight with the devil, a feature that accounts for the inherently violent and vengeful character of the movement." End quote. The trial of the plotters of the Students' Conspiracy of October 1923, as it was referred to by the press, took place on March 29th, 1924. The day before the trial opened, Ion Mota, one of the conspirators, managed to wrestle away a police officer's gun and shot one of his fellow prisoners, Alexandru Vrănicescu. It had been previously revealed that he was the one who betrayed the conspiracy to the police in the first place. I was unable to find any information stating whether Vrănicescu died after being shot by Mota, but the others, including Codreanu, considered justice to have been served. Codreanu especially had no patience for traitors within his ranks. Quote, "It was no longer possible to continue the student movement and tolerate the treason of one like Vrănicescu, as others would have followed his example and allowed themselves to be bought off by enemies of the Romanian nation, sure of going unpunished." End quote. Curiously, Mota's brazen shooting of the turncoat Vrănicescu does not seem to have affected the outcome of the trial. Ultimately, the fact that the conspiracy had been interrupted before any concrete plans had been laid out saved the conspirators from spending the rest of their lives in prison, as, according to Romanian law at the time, their actions could not be properly considered to be an attempted assassination. All of the defendants were acquitted and were promptly released from prison, save for Mota, who is now being charged with attempted murder, but he would be acquitted at a later date. The student conspirators of October 1923 emerged from prison as changed men. In Mota's estimation, the conspiracy and subsequent trial marked a significant turning point in the movement that he and the others had started. Quote, "The student plot of the fall of 1923 is the first manifestation of our great separation from the old alienated world. It sets us at a considerable distance from our nationalist parents and professors. In the beginning, they had regarded the student's gesture with reservation." End quote. As for Codreanu, this whole ordeal served to validate his belief that the current political system was incapable of doing what he thought had to be done vis-a-vis the Jews. In order to effect an actual solution to the Jewish problem, it would be necessary for him and his movement to attain political power at a national level. He summarized his conclusions in the following way, quote, "The Romanian people will not be able to solve the Jewish problem unless it first solves the problem of its own political parties. The first aim to be reached by the Romanian people on its way to topple the Judaic power that oppresses and strangles it will have to be the toppling of the political system. The problem is even deeper than Professor Cuza has shown it to be. The mission of this fight has been entrusted to the Romanian youth, if it wants to take up the challenge of this historical mission. If it wants to go on living To continue having a country, it must prepare and gather all its forces to fight and win." End quote. Finally, as for the others, Tudos Popescu, Corneliu Georgescu, Ilie Garnatea, and Radu Mironovici, they would become known, together with Codreanu and Mota, as the Vacaranesti, after the name of the prison, and would form the nucleus of the new movement that Codreanu planned to create. Codreanu wasted little time in beginning the work that he felt had to be done. On May 6, 1924, he gathered together about 60 students and proposed that they undertake a project to construct a new student center at Unkheni, a town just to the east of Iasi. The rationale behind this project was to impart to these students the value of hard work and discipline. Before they began the work, Codreanu addressed the group, quote, "Granted, none of us has built a house or made bricks before. I can understand that we need in the first place to break down the mentality in which we have grown up, the mentality that makes the young intellectual who, the second day after becoming a student, is ashamed to carry a package on the street. We need the courage and the willpower to start again from scratch, the willpower to uproot obstacles and overcome difficulties." End quote. Despite some initial challenges securing funding, the group set to work on constructing the new building that Codreanu proposed. For his part, Codreanu found the work invigorating, a massive improvement from the drudgery of prison. Quote, "Student life passed quietly. There were no longer street demonstrations and incidents. We worked full of joy and hope, thinking that we would soon have our own place to call home." End quote. About 3 weeks passed in this manner before, on the morning of May 31st, catastrophe struck. That morning they arrived at the construction site to find it taken over by police, who placed everyone under arrest. Codreanu claims that he and many others were savagely beaten by the policemen, who also threatened to shoot them on the spot if they resisted. The arrested students were then taken back to the police prefecture. Once there, the local police prefect, Constantin Manciu, oversaw the interrogation of the detainees. Codreanu claims that many of his comrades underwent torture at this time, and, moreover, that he was about to receive the same treatment when Professor Cuza arrived at the precinct demanding his release. Thanks to Cuza's interference, Codreanu was not tortured, but was held in prison for 2 more days. Before his release, Codreanu swore to the judge that he would seek vengeance. Quote, "Your Honor, if I am not given justice, I am going to get it myself." End quote. Later, when Cuza paid him a visit at his home, he tried to talk Codreanu down from doing anything drastic, telling him, quote, "We have heard that you want to take the law into your own hands. Do not do anything of the sort. We will report this to the Ministry of the Interior and demand an investigation. It is impossible that we shall not receive satisfaction." End quote. As much as the stint in Vacaresti prison, this most recent incident profoundly affected Codreanu. In his memoir, he describes his thoughts and feelings as he departed Iasi for the mountain of Rarau, where he hoped to clear his mind. Quote, "I was morally crushed. All my plans had collapsed. I wondered what sins I may have committed that God sent this misfortune upon my head. Now, when I was preparing to launch such a grand and beautiful plan, my soul was ravaged by doubt. I was at a crossroads. We were fighting for the good of the country, and we were treated like enemies of the people. We were mercilessly hit by the government, police, gendarmes, and all." End quote. In a very biblical manner, Codreanu spent 40 days and 40 nights atop the mountain, all the while agonizing over what was to be done. Divine inspiration did not overtake him this time, however, and upon descending from the mountain, Codreanu had failed to devise any solution. He and his associates attempted nearly every legal means at their disposal to get justice for the incident on May 31st. They wrote articles for local newspapers, denouncing the actions of the police and demanding that they be held accountable. They held rallies and wrote petitions to the king and the Minister of the Interior pleading for justice. Just as Professor Cuza promised, an official investigation into the matter was ordered. However, none of these produced any positive result for the aggrieved party. In fact, Codreanu claims that the police prefect Manciu actually received a promotion. Quote, "Encouraged by these measures, the police unleashed further persecution against us, this time extending it over the whole of Moldavia. Any commissar, to increase his source of revenue from the Jews or to get a promotion, grabbed a student by the throat and beat him to a pulp in the street, having to answer to no one for his deeds." End quote. Having exhausted all legal recourse, Codreanu decided to make good on his vow and exact vengeance himself. On October 24th, Codreanu shot Prefect Manciu in the middle of a courthouse, as well as a couple of officers who were standing nearby. Manciu was killed, while the other 2 were seriously wounded. Codreanu surrendered to police on the spot, making no effort to resist his arrest. After a brief questioning, he was taken to the Galata prison in Iasi to await trial. The killing of police prefect Monsiu caused a great sensation. The prefect had been unpopular in Iasi for some time on account of his corruption, and public opinion was on the side of Codreanu. In his book, Codreanu reprints a few newspaper articles containing quotes from locals on the incident. Quote, "Personally, I salute Corneliu Codreanu's heroic gesture, who once again remains intransigent in matters of honor and determined where dignity is involved. Public opinion is on Corneliu Codreanu's side. It likes his manly gesture, and appreciating the superior motive of this gesture, warning a regime and serving an idea, absolves him of the customary incrimination for such a deed, justifying him completely and in fact. Prefect Monsiu, by his impulsive temperament, lacking any self-control, imagined he reached a pinnacle of glory by the application of his system. It is this sequence of events that brought Prefect Monsiu to the last act of his tragedy. Corneliu Zelea Codreanu acted in legitimate defense." End quote. Because of Codreanu's popularity within Iasi, it was deemed inappropriate to hold his trial there. So, in January, it was transferred to the city of Focșani. Long thought to be a liberal stronghold, it was hoped that by moving the trial there, Codreanu might actually be convicted. However, this did not turn out to be the case. Codreanu describes the way that he was received in the city. Quote, "The miracle that neither I nor those who brought me to Focșani expected was that 3 days after my arrival, the whole populace, irrespective of political party, and in spite of the endeavors on the part of the authorities to turn it against me, spontaneously came over to my side. Liberal politicians were abandoned not only by their supporters, but by their own families as well. For example, a group of high school girls sent me food and sewed for me a shirt. I heard they even refused to sit at the table for meals with their fathers." End quote. Then, 2 days before the trial was to begin, trainloads of people arrived in Focșani, coming from across the country in support of Codreanu. The authorities deemed it necessary to move the location of the trial once again, this time to the town of Turnul Severin, on the border with Yugoslavia. Codreanu was spirited away from Focșani by train in the dead of night to avoid arousing suspicion. While en route, Codreanu began to worry. His destination, Turnul Severin, was literally on the exact opposite side of the country. He'd never been there in his whole life. He wondered what kind of people would serve as his jurors. The long-awaited trial opened on May 20th, 1925. The magistrate had received nearly 2,000 petitions from lawyers across the country asking to represent Codreanu in court. The trial itself lasted for just 6 days. According to one eyewitness, the proceedings appeared to be little more than formality, and that the outcome of the trial was preordained. It was Codreanu who took the floor last. Addressing the jury, he declared, quote, "Everything we have fought for was out of faith and love for our country and the Romanian people. We assumed the obligation to fight until the end. This is my last word." End quote. The jury did not deliberate for long, and when they emerged, they did so wearing armbands in the color of the Romanian flag, with a swastika, the symbol of the LANC, in the center. Their verdict was, of course, not guilty. The city erupted in celebration. Quote, "As soon as the verdict of acquittal was read to us, I was carried on shoulders outside, where there were thousands of people assembled. They all fell into a column, carrying us on their shoulders along the streets, while people on the sidewalks showered us with flowers. When we reached Mr. Tilaka Ioanid's home, I addressed the people from his balcony in a few words expressing my gratitude to the Romanians of Turnul Severin for the great love that they had shown to me during the trial." End quote. The next day, Codreanu left to return to Iasi by way of Bucharest. He claimed that at every stop along the way, locals came out to greet him as he passed through. He goes on, quote, "It seemed that an unknown force had compelled them to come, mysteriously whispering to them, 'Go to the depot,' for among all the trains that pass by, there is one that goes on the line of Romania's destiny. All the rest run for the interests of those riding on them, save for this one, that runs on the people's course, for the people." End quote. Codreanu returned to Iasi in triumph. The people lined the streets to greet him, showering him with praise, blessing, and songs. Shortly thereafter, Codreanu married a woman named Elena Ioanid, whom he had become engaged to the previous year. Not much can be said about her, other than that she is generally described as a modest woman who stayed out of political affairs. The wedding was every bit as much of a spectacle as Codreanu's return had been. He claimed that between 80,000 and 100,000 people were present for the wedding, which took place at Focșani. Quote, "After the religious ceremony, we danced the hora and other national dances, and the celebration continued with a banquet. The inhabitants of Focșani brought provisions for everyone. The whole festivity, with the great display of national costumes, bedecked wagons, with its dancing and enthusiasm, was filmed. The celebration ended towards the evening with a general feeling of brotherhood and animation." End quote. And now, a word from our sponsor. And now, back to the show. Following the conclusion of his most recent legal ordeal, Codreanu resumed his activities with the LANC. However, a rift was forming between himself and the nominal leader of the party, Professor A.C. Cuza. The essence of the issue was that Cuza had thus far envisioned the LANC as a traditional bourgeois party, and as such had organized it on a democratic basis. In other words, anyone who wished to join the party was welcome to do so. Although this attitude of acceptance had led to the party's ranks swelling in recent months, to Codreanu this presented its own set of problems. In his estimation, many of the individuals recently admitted into the party lacked a certain strength of moral character. Some were opportunists and profiteers, others balked at discipline, and still others sowed intrigue within the party's ranks. Codreanu likened these people to an infectious disease. Quote, "If signs of gangrene such as those mentioned above appear evident in an organization, they must be immediately isolated, then extirpated most energetically. If not, the cancer spreads throughout the entire organism of the movement and the cause is lost. Its mission and future being compromised, it will either die or drag out its days between life and death, incapable of accomplishing anything at all." End quote. Codreanu and the other Vakarineshti urged Cuza to raise the standards for party membership, but he refused to do so. Codreanu recognized Cuza's intellectual achievements and continued to praise him for this, but at the same time, he recognized that in order to accomplish their aims, a different kind of leader was needed. Quote, "Professor Cuza is above all else a theoretician. On the theoretical plane he shines like the sun, but if the doctrinaire is expected to master the science of research and formulating the truth, the leader of a political movement is expected to master the science and art of organization, education, and leadership of men. Professor Cuza, excelling and unsurpassed on the theoretical plane, when brought down to the level of the practical, showed himself ignorant, awkward, and naive as a child, incapable of organizing or of technically and heroically educating his followers. In other words, incapable of leading human forces." End quote. In Codreanu's estimation, there were 9 qualities that a political leader needed that Cuza simply did not demonstrate. They were 1. An inner power of attraction, 2. Capacity for love, 3. Knowledge and sense of organizing, 4. Knowledge of people, 5. The power to educate and inspire heroism, 6. Mastering the laws of leadership, 7. A sense of timing, 8. Courage, and 9. The conscience of just and moral objectives to be pursued. Ultimately, despite his criticism of Cuza, Codreanu still had too much respect for him to break with him openly and potentially split the party. Instead, he chose to distance himself from the situation. He left the country once more, ostensibly to further his studies. Accompanied by Mota, Codreanu departed for France in September 1925. They chose to reside in Grenoble, a city in southeastern France, on the foothills of the Alps. In his memoirs, he describes some of the sights of the city. Quote, "I visited a little old church on the edge of town dating back to the 4th century, and to my astonishment, I saw on its blue-tinted ceiling more than 50 swastikas. In the city, on the prefecture building, the Palace of Justice, and other government institutions, one could see the Masonic star, the symbol of the absolute control of this Jewish hydra over France. This is why I retreated into the old quarter of Grenoble, where the churches and their crosses had been darkened by age and forgetfulness. I turned my back on modern movie houses, theaters, and cafes, finding enjoyment instead in the ruins in which the knight Bayard may have lived. I sank myself into the past, where, to my great happiness, I lived in the historic France, in Christian, nationalist France, and not in the Judeo-Masonic, atheistic, and cosmopolitan France, in the France of Bayard, and not that of Leon Blum." End quote. In May of the next year, Prime Minister Ion Brătianu handed power over to General Alexandru Averescu, and a general election was called. The incumbent Liberal Party was quite unpopular, and Averescu's party, the People's Party, very much seemed favored to win. The general had a reputation as a war hero, and his political messaging was populist, although not explicitly anti-Semitic. This would be the first general election in Romania to be held since the founding of the LANC. Despite his issues with Professor Cuza's leadership, Codreanu saw this as a great opportunity for the movement. Once again, he cut his time abroad short to return to Romania and participate in the elections. The 1926 Romanian general election has been described by one historian as, quote, one of the most outrageous elections in the interwar period, end quote. General Averescu's People's Party won a resounding victory, garnering over 53% of the vote and defeating the runners-up by 25%. The LANC came in fourth place overall, with 124,778 votes total, and winning 10 seats in parliament. Codreanu, who put himself forward as a candidate in Focșani, lost. Due to the LANC's lack of electoral infrastructure, he had been forced to more or less fend for himself. During that time, he witnessed the other parties intimidate voters, falsify results, and bribe officials. He claimed that he himself was prohibited from campaigning by the police. All of these served to validate his pre-existing anti-democratic sentiments. He summarized his thoughts on the election results, quote, "Pity justice and legality in this country. One is given the privilege of voting, and one is called on to exercise this privilege. If you don't show up to vote, you are fined. If you do vote, you are beaten. Romanian politicians, regardless if they are liberals, supporters of Averescu, or national peasants, are only a band of tyrants who hide behind slogans like legality, freedom, and the rights of man, fearfully trample underfoot a whole country with its laws. What possible recourse is left to us, I wonder?" End quote. Codreanu returned to France after the election, but did not stay for long. In May 1927, he received an urgent message from Ion Mota, informing him that the LANC had split, urging him to return at once to do what he could to save the party. Reluctantly, Codreanu did as he was asked, and made immediately for Bucharest. There he found the situation was worse than he had initially envisioned. Quote, "It was a disaster. The League had broken in two. The hopes of this nation were crumbling. A whole people who strained to gather up its exhausted strength in a difficult moment of history, and had fought the greatest peril to ever threaten its existence, was now falling to the ground, all of its hopes shattered." End quote. A cursory investigation of the schism showed that the main cause was interpersonal conflict within the party. After the election, certain members of the LANC began to blame others for their loss, accusing each other of either being Jewish or in the pay of Jews, and so on and so forth. Codreanu tried to mitigate the damage and rally the League back together, but it was no use. The rifts within the League of Christian National Defense seemed impossible to mend, and the party itself a spent force. With the split of the LANC, Codreanu decided that it was time to act on the plans that he had originally devised 3 years ago. On June 24, 1927, Codreanu called together a meeting of the former Vacaresti prison group. There, he read aloud the following order. Quote, "Today, Friday, June 24, 1927, the feast of St. John the Baptist, at 10 p.m., the Legion of St. Michael the Archangel is founded under my leadership. Whosoever comes into its ranks, let him believe totally. Whoever stays without, let him have doubts. I appoint Radu Mironovici as guardian of the icon." End quote. And so, with the reading of this declaration, the Legion of the Archangel Michael was officially formed. The creation of this new organization would be a great undertaking, and all those who were present at its founding recognized the gravity of the situation. Quote, "Even to the Vacaresti group I had given time for reflection and search of their conscience, for them to be sure whether they had any doubts or reservations, because once they enrolled, they had to unhesitatingly keep going on for the rest of their lives. Our intimate feelings from which the Legion was born were these. It did not interest us whether we would triumph or be conquered, or even whether we would die. Our purpose was different, to advance united, moving forward in a united front, with the help of God and the Romanian people's justice, no matter what destiny awaited us, that of being vanquished or that of death, it would be a blessed one and would bear fruit for our people. Professor Nicolae Iorga once said, 'There are defeats and deaths that can awaken a nation to life, just as there are triumphs of the kind that can put a nation to sleep.'" End quote. From the beginning, the Legion would be motivated by the spirit of self-sacrifice. The same day as the founding of the Legion, the Vacarinesti paid a visit to Professor Cuza, asking to be released from their vows that they had taken as members of the LANC. Cuza obliged and wished them all the best luck in their future endeavors. Now, before we begin to delve into the Legion's political activities, I think it would be appropriate to take some time to discuss the Legion's ideology and organizational structure. Now, there are numerous facets to the ideology of the Legion, and as such, it's difficult to cover this subject comprehensively. It's also worth pointing out that the ideology of the Legion did not emerge in 1927 fully formed. Rather, it would crystallize over time and assume a more definite form by 1930. With all that in mind, a good place to begin this inquiry is with the question of how the Legion differed from its predecessor, the League of Christian National Defense. For one, the Legion would lean much more heavily into religion. In his study of the Legion, Nicholas Nagy Talavera writes, quote, "The only fascist movement to be founded under the protective symbol of an icon had a profoundly religious ideology, blended with nationalism to such an extent that it is impossible to draw the line between them." End quote. The Legion's leaders even went so far as to deny that the Legion was a political party, rather insisting that it was a religious movement. When, some months later, Cuza accused the Legionaries of engaging in petty politics, Ioanid responded, in the first issue of the Legion's new official newspaper, called The Ancestral Land, quote, "We do not do politics, and we have never done it for a single day in our lives. We have a religion. We are slaves to a faith. We are consumed by its fire and completely dominated by it. We will serve it until our last breath." End quote. The overtly religious nature of the Legion stood in contrast to other fascist movements in Europe at the time, which were largely secular and even occasionally hostile to religious institutions. As one member of the Legion, Mihai Polichronade, put it, quote, "Fascism worships the state, Nazism worships the race and the nation. Our movement strives not merely to fulfill the destiny of the Romanian people, we want to fulfill it along the road to salvation. The Legion is the only political movement with a religious structure." End quote. While it isn't my intention here to get bogged down in a wholly theoretical discussion of ideology and religion, it is necessary to dig a bit deeper into the Legion's beliefs to better understand them. In his excellent study of the Legion's ideology, Constantin Iordachi provides this outline of their beliefs, quote, "The Legion put forward a charismatic scenario of divine salvation through violent struggle. The scenario had the following main components. Firstly, faith in an omnipotent but benevolent God, who harbored divine plans for election and salvation. Second, belief in the Romanian nation as the elect nation, able to bring about the salvation and redemption of all humankind. Third, belief in Archangel Michael as the guardian angel of said elect nation. Fourth, Corneliu Zelea Codreanu as the predestined charismatic commander leading the way to salvation. Fifth, the Legionaries as God's chosen warriors and martyrs of the new creed for national salvation. And sixth, the Romanian people, past and present, and humanity in general as the recipients of salvation." End quote. This fixation on the concept of national salvation naturally begs the question, what did the Romanian people need to be saved from? This question actually has a rather straightforward answer, and it is precisely what you might expect it to be. The enemies in this holy war the Legion was waging were, of course, the Jews, whom they construed to be demons, and their non-Jewish collaborators. All this talk about religious doctrine is all well and good, but at this point one may feel compelled to ask what the political program of the Legion was. In other words, once they actually achieved power, what would they do? As we've already seen from Ioanid's article, the Legion outwardly denied having a political nature whatsoever. Addressing the same question, Codreanu wrote, quote, "This country goes to pieces not from a lack of programs, but because of the lack of men to carry them out. In our opinion, the task is not to formulate programs, but to create men, a new kind of man." End quote. This concept of the new man, that is, the idea of a new, idealized form of human existence, is by no means unique to the Legion. This concept, which can be said to have originated in the late 19th century with Friedrich Nietzsche, can be found across the political spectrum. Fascist iterations of the concept emphasize virtues like strength, masculinity, belief in national regeneration, devotion to the nation, and so on. Codreanu himself described the new man that his movement strove to create in the following terms, quote, "From this legionary school a new man will have to emerge, a man with heroic qualities, a giant of our history to do battle with and win over the enemies of our fatherland, his battle and victory having to extend even beyond the material world into the realm of invisible enemies, the forces of evil. Everything that our mind can imagine, more beautiful spiritually, everything the proudest that our race can produce, greater, more just, powerful, wiser, purer, more diligent and more heroic. This is what the Legionary school must give us, a man in whom all the possibilities of human grandeur that are implemented by God in the blood of our people be developed to the maximum." End quote. It has been suggested that the Legionary project of forging this new man was essentially a way for the Legion's leadership to sidestep the fact that they did not yet have a concrete political program. Nagy Talavera writes, quote, "In this period when the Legion had no political responsibility, the lack of a program was a definite advantage. By appealing to the intangible, the essential, and the irrational, it could reach people more easily on both the lowest and highest levels." End quote. In other words, in this earliest phase of its existence, the Legion would focus primarily on building its strength and accumulating power for its own sake, under the assumption that the issues facing the nation would essentially be solved by others at a later date, kicking the can down the road, as it were. Codreanu's own writing supports this interpretation. Quote, "This hero, the product of legionary education, will know how to elaborate programs, will also know to solve the Jewish problem, will also know to organize the state well, and will know how to convince the other Romanians, and, if not, he will know how to win, for that is why he is a hero. This hero, this legionary of bravery, labor, and justice, with the powers of God implanted in his soul, will lead our fatherland on its road of glory." End quote. So, at the risk of sounding repetitive, in this embryonic phase of its existence, the Legion would be primarily occupied with building strength and acquiring power. But how would they go about doing this? For one, they sought to imbue their messaging with a populist appeal. The Legion's leaders saw the Romanian peasantry as their natural base of support, and as such took measures to win them over. Practically speaking, this strategy made a lot of sense. As I explained in the first episode, Romania's economy was primarily based on agriculture, and peasants made up the vast majority of the country's population. Generally speaking, the peasantry was already somewhat predisposed towards the Legion, given the fact that anti-Semitic views were much more widespread among the peasantry than they were among the educated upper classes. That said, Codreanu recognized the need to appeal to people on a material level. Quote, "The Legionaries will give the workers more than a program. We will give them whiter bread, a better bed, and the right to feel themselves masters of their own country." End quote. Simply organizing among the peasants would not be sufficient for a political movement to come to power. If Codreanu's recent experiences had taught him anything, it was that violent struggle was necessary to attain his political goals. He knew well that the forces of the state were arrayed against his efforts, and sooner or later it would be necessary for the Legion to retaliate in kind. This is why he sought to create a military ethos within the Legion. The fact that they even referred to themselves as the Legion in the first place is reflective of this. The ideal legionary was a spiritual warrior and a physical one. His training was intended to strengthen both mind and body. Because of the physical danger inherent in such an enterprise, the Legion sought to lionize ideals of suffering and sacrifice. Codreanu saw the Legion as the most recent inheritors of a long martial tradition in Romania. Quote, "The students arose to battle, walking on the great path of national destiny, side by side with all those who fought, suffered, and died as martyrs for our land and its people." End quote. As time went on and more legionaries would fall in battle, the value placed on sacrifice and martyrdom would take precedence over all else, leading some scholars to argue that the Legion morphed into something resembling a death cult toward the end of its existence, but I'm getting way ahead of myself. I'll have a lot more to say about that later on. So, thus far, we've discussed the Legion's religious doctrine, their political program, or lack thereof, and a bit about their strategic outlook. Before we wrap up this episode, let's talk a bit about the Legion's organization. The Legion was unique among other fascist movements in that its structure was somewhat decentralized, while at the same time remaining very much hierarchical. Allow me to explain. In Codreanu's initial conception, the basic unit of the Legion would be the quib, or in English, the nest. Essentially, the nest was a small group of 3 to 13 individuals under one leader. These nests were organized territorially, and each would have a certain degree of autonomy, thereby allowing them to solve local issues and adapt to local conditions. Still, the leaders of each nest were directly accountable to Codreanu himself, who could appoint and dismiss such people as he saw fit. Iordachi describes the sorts of activities that the nests were meant to engage in. Quote, "The main tasks of the nests were to collect funds, conduct propaganda activities, recruit new members, initiate labor camps, and carry out orders sent by the superior echelons of the legion." End quote. Each nest also belonged to a section, of which there were 4, each serving a specific function. Section 1 was the youth section, Section 2 designated for older members of the legion, Section 3 was composed of women and the elderly, with its members acting in supporting roles, and finally Section 4, the international section, designated for ethnic Romanians living abroad. Atop the legionary hierarchy was, of course, Codreanu, or the captain, as he would come to be called. As we've seen, Codreanu was the dominant personality within the legion's predecessor groups, and this would continue throughout the legion's existence until his death, arguably even after his death. By all accounts, Codreanu was indeed a charismatic leader, as was true of most other fascist leaders of this era. He tended to make a deep impression on those who encountered him. That said, the cult of personality that would develop around him over the course of the 1930s was, as Iordachi posits, quote, "a conscious political construction promoted by the Legion's top leadership and then adopted and further developed at a grassroots level." End quote. The individual most singularly responsible for bringing this cult of personality into existence was Codreanu's second-in-command, Ion Mota. In his writings, Mota attributes to Codreanu a saint-like, almost messianic quality. This can be seen as early as 1927, when he wrote, quote, "Corneliu is like a saint to me. Even if no one else follows him, I will do so. He will be the chief, and I will be his strongest soldier." End quote. This was a belief that Mota would take with him to his grave. In his last will and testament, Mota wrote the following, quote, "I have seen in this man a providential human being sent to us by God to redeem our people from the destruction forced upon us by our centuries-old enemies. Choosing the title of captain, I wanted to place him in the ranks of the world's most famous captains. For instance, Hannibal Barca. I do not think that events will prove me wrong. Corneliu Zelea Codreanu will remain in the national and political history of our people over centuries as its leading light." End quote. To close out this episode, I'd like to now read a first-hand account from someone who encountered Corneliu Zelea Codreanu in person. This passage is taken from Nicholas Nagy Talavera's book, The Green Shirts and the Others. The events in question took place when the author was 8 years old. Quote, "Though very young at the time, the writer remembers well the turbulent days of the autumn of 1937, when the most hotly contested elections of the interwar period were being held in Transylvania. As a child of 8, I visited with my parents some relatives and family friends in a village deep in the Apuseni Mountains, the heart of Romanian Transylvania, home of the Moti and the birthplace of the legendary Avram Iancu. In the evening, when the intelligentsia gathered in the salon of the owner of the local sawmill, a Hungarian Jew, the venerable Dowager Duchess of village society discussed but one thing: the coming visit of Codreanu, the dreaded captain of the Iron Guard. There was simply no limit to the abuse that these ladies and gentlemen, Hungarians of the Christian and Jewish faith, heaped upon him. One of the ladies had seen him in Targu Mures the year before, and spoke of him as if she had seen the head of a monster but dared not describe it. Being somewhat of an adventurer by nature, I decided that I should take a look at this fabulous being whatever the cost. The next day I proceeded to carry out my decision. My best friend, the son of the local Orthodox priest, provided me with some pieces of peasant costume, and the conspirators and I went to the churchyard where the Legionary meeting was to take place. The little square before the church teemed with peasants all dressed in their colorful Sunday best. Many of them had walked dozens of miles to get there, and there were many, perhaps too many, gendarmes from the local station. The prefect of the district of Turda had, as officials of inefficient, corrupt regimes often do, administered a pinprick to exasperate rather than a blow to crush. He had forbidden Codreanu to speak, but not outlawed the meeting itself, and the crowd of simple, miserable peasants swelled until the churchyard could hold no more. Then there was suddenly a hush in the crowd. A tall, darkly handsome man, dressed in the white costume of a Romanian peasant, rode into the yard on a white horse. He halted close to me, but I could see nothing monstrous or evil within him. On the contrary, his childlike, sincere smile radiated over the miserable crowd, and yet he seemed to be mysteriously apart from it. Charisma is an inadequate word to describe the strange force that emanated from this man. He was more aptly a part of the forests, of the mountains, of the storms on the snow-covered peaks of the Carpathians, of the lakes and rivers. And so he stood amid the crowd, silently. He had no need to speak. His silence was eloquent, and it seemed stronger than we, stronger than the order of the prefect who denied him the right to speak. An old white-haired peasant woman made the sign of the cross on her chest and whispered to us, "The emissary of the Archangel Michael." Then the sad little church bell began to toll, and the service which invariably preceded legionary meetings began. Deep impressions in the soul of a child die hard. I have never forgotten my meeting with Corneliu Zelea Codreanu. End quote.
And it is on that note that I will end the narrative for today. In the next episode, we will continue to follow the Legion of the Archangel Michael from its founding onward, as they begin the work of building up their strength in preparation for the inevitable power struggle with the Romanian government. But you'll have to tune in again in 2 weeks to hear the next part of the story. In the meantime, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, or anything else you'd like for me to address, you can direct them to me via my email, perspectivesinhistorypod@gmail.com. Alternatively, you can reach me via Twitter or Facebook. Links to both sites will be in this episode's description. If you like the show and would like to help support it, you can do so either by leaving a review of the show on whichever podcast listening platform you prefer, or by purchasing some used books from me on eBay. A link will be in the episode description. Anyway, this has been the Perspectives in History podcast. Thank you once more for listening. I'm your host, Willem Connor, signing off.